Hey everybody, how you guys doing? So my name is Mike Cottmeyer. I'll put my title slide up here. I don't have a clicker today, so I'm going to use one slide for this entire presentation, and we're going to see how this goes. And so I've been doing this Agile thing for a while now. I run a company based out of Atlanta called Leading Agile, and we've been growing a lot. We're about 110 people and doing some pretty big Agile transformation kind of work around the country. And so what we're basically going to go over today is kind of our general hypothesis on the kinds of things that you guys need to consider in order to be able to do this. One little fun fact before we get started is that, like I said, I'm going to go through one slide. This actually does have like a whole accompanying deck and a white paper, and there's like videos of other versions of the presentation. So if you guys want to text Agile to 345-345, Tim will make sure that you get access to all of that kind of stuff. So with that, I am going to use the one slide that we're going to do, and then I'm going to come off the stage and talk to you guys. So talk to me a little bit. We don't have a ton of time today. Talk to me a little bit about like what's like what do you think's the largest transformation going on in the room? Is it greater than 5,000? Anybody doing that? Okay, so not super large. Anybody greater than 1,000 people? Okay. Really, is everything like greater than 500? Okay, so there's a lot of like, so seriously, like greater than 100? Okay, people just aren't raising their hands. Okay, so you guys are all lying to me. Okay, cool. Because it's got to be, like you guys wouldn't be here in an Agile transformation talk if if everything was that small and relatively simple. So one of the things that I like to ask an audience before I do a transformation talk, Agile Manifesto was written in 2001. Scrum was around 10 years before that. SAFe's been around a long time. Why is this so hard? Why is it so hard to do this? Right? So if you guys were in the keynote, he went over kind of like, amongst other things, kind of the basic framework of Scrum. Did everybody understand the basic framework of Scrum? So why is it so hard? Right? And so that's the question that I want to talk about in this talk. The challenge that I've got, it's like, is that Agile was designed to work in a particular organizational context. Okay? It was designed for a certain kind of team structure. It was designed for a certain kind of governance. It was designed for a certain kind of organizational ecosystem. And my fundamental hypothesis is because of a lot of different things, dependencies first amongst them, it's very difficult to get that context in place. And so one of the things that we've been distinguishing between within our practice is the idea of a system of delivery versus a system of transformation. So when you guys go to Scrum class and you learn how to do Scrum, you are learning a system of delivery. When you learn how to do SAFe and you learn all the stuff about SAFe, all the different roles and cadences and things like that, you are learning a system of delivery. How you get the organization from its current state into the kind of state where it can actually take advantage of that methodology is what I'm calling a system of transformation. Okay? How are we going to move from point A to point B so that we can start leveraging the methodology? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So system of delivery, system of transformation, very different. One of the things that, it's actually super distracting with that, it's so loud next door. I'm going to like try to hold a train of thought here. Yeah, can we get them to like quiet down? No, I'm just kidding. No, but it's funny. It's like a bad day to pick to like not actually have slides to go off of because like I'm trying to craft this narrative in my head for you guys. No, but anyway, so the idea of the difference between a system of delivery versus a system of transformation. And my hypothesis is that the reason why we are all struggling to get Agile done right at scale is because we're not fully appreciating the amount of work that it takes to actually get the ecosystem right, okay? And that's why we're sitting here 20 years later still struggling with this. So the first thing that I want to do as we go through this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the frame that we're going to be operating in. You know, so much of what we're trying to do when we're trying to talk about transformation is trying to get people to actually move, right? We have to figure out how to build momentum within the organization. We have to get people to do different things. And in reality, transformation is largely like a change management activity. How do we get people from doing the things that they're doing today to doing a different set of things tomorrow? We have to figure out how to create safety for that. And so really what I've got up on the screen right now that we're going to go into a bit are the elements that we believe are necessary to create the safety to get people to move. So the first thing, I'm just going to hit them at a high level. The first thing is we have to have a business case. Okay? Anybody adopting Agile just for the sake of adopting Agile because it's like the coolest thing to do in their organization? Right? Few people. I mean, seriously, right? I mean, sometimes people are just adopting Agile because they can't hire people unless they're Agile, right? Nobody wants to work in a waterfall environment anymore. But typically, when we talk about doing an Agile transformation, there's a business driver that we want to take into consideration. You know, whether you guys have hired external consultants, whether you've bought tools, whether you're staffing internally, one thing that you will find is that Agile transformations are expensive. And there's really not a whole lot of reason to do it unless there's a return on investment. So one of the things I want to do a little bit is explore what are the kinds of returns on investment that most organizations are looking for. The next thing that I'm going to go into is what on this slide I call a transformation hypothesis. And a transformation hypothesis basically is going to explore what levers do you intend to pull within the organization so that you can get the business benefit in the business case. So if we're going to start with culture, how is culture change going to drive ROI? If we're going to teach people safe, what is our hypothesis for how safe is going to drive innovation? Right? We want to get a really clear connection between the levers you're going to pull and the outcomes that you hope to achieve. Okay? And part of that conversation is going to be around what are going to be the things that are going to get in our way and prevent us from being able to realize that business value. The third thing, what is your theory and approach? Okay? One of the things that we've been trying to unpack for the last 9 years almost is this idea of, like, what does it look like as the organization is moving from, you know, waterfall's a little bit of a boogeyman, but let's just say that, right? Moving from waterfall to moving to Agile. Anybody have any experience with that flipping overnight? I'm glad you guys laughed. Awesome. Okay. So there's occasionally you get somebody raising their hand. It's pretty awesome, but okay, cool. So most of you guys don't have any experience with it flipping overnight. That's because it doesn't flip overnight, right? So what is it going to look like as we're transitioning? Okay? Because just trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing is not super smart when your job's on the line. Okay? Does anybody in the room believe that you're supposed to take everything in the SAFE guide and to deploy it in your organization verbatim? No? Right? We all kind of agree it's designed to be tailored, right? On what principles do you tailor it? Right? Does everybody have a really clear idea of what is non-negotiable versus negotiable when they're tailoring a methodology? Like, what things could you leave out and still have it not work, or still have it work? Right? Okay, so one of the things that we've been distinguishing between quite a bit lately is this idea of what we call a reference architecture versus a reference implementation. What we've found useful is this idea that there's a bunch of base patterns that we believe transcend any of the methodologies. You can find them in LESS, you can find them in SAFE, you can find them in Disciplined Agile Delivery, in the small you can find them in Scrum, you can find them in XP. The reference architecture holds universally. The reference implementation is what is negotiable. So understanding the base patterns that you can't violate is like a really big deal. right? And so as you think about it, right, so we understand our business case. We understand what levers we want to pull. We're going to start articulating a strategy for how we get there. The reference architecture is going to help us understand what it is that we're pointing at. What are we moving towards? Because here's another interesting thing. As you move from an early stage transformation to a late stage transformation, your methodology is actually going to change. You're going to have to do things to manage dependencies early that you won't necessarily have to do after you start breaking dependencies. So if our reference architecture, if the underlying patterns stay the same, we can start to tailor the methodology without breaking it as we move from higher control to lower control through the course of the transformation. Okay, so the reference architecture gives us a guide as to what we are shooting towards. The third thing, or the fifth thing rather, where I get third thing from, change model, right? How are we going to start articulating how we're going to change and shift the organization? How are we going to start to measure progress? How are we going to start to validate to the organization that not only are we making progress on the transformation, but that we're making progress towards being able to deliver against those business goals that are actually funding the transformation at the end of the day, right? That greater predictability, that greater innovation, that greater product fit, greater return on investment, that kind of a thing. Okay? And then, like the last bit of the column, the who side, is what roles and responsibilities are necessary in order to be able to launch a transformation, and what skill sets do you need to launch a transformation. So for me, right, this why, what, how, who, this business case to transformation hypothesis, theory and approach, reference architecture, change model, metrics, roles and responsibilities, skill sets, this is what a transformation plan consists of. How are we going to get from point A to B? Okay, you guys ready? First section? Okay, so we're going to talk about the business case. Business case typically comes down to one of six things, or multiples of these six things. And I'd be interested if anybody has any other thoughts. But the six things for me are typically predictability, right? We want to be able to make and meet commitments. We want high quality. We want to make sure that we're building the product in such a way that we're not putting crap in the market, right? We want early return on investment. Basically means we want optionality to deploy so that we can start charging money for things earlier, right? Gosh, I do not have my slides. So predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost savings, right? A lot of people, anybody want to do Agile because they think it's going to save them money? Yeah, happens all the time. Really a tough one to guarantee because most organizations are 10 times overloaded from what they can actually do. And so you can lean that out. You can make sure that you're building the highest value, best things. But promising cost savings is pretty dicey. Sometimes there's misallocated people in organizations, like there's too many project managers or too many BAs. Sometimes there's too many testers, not usually. But sometimes there's some reallocation of resources that you can do. And then innovation, right? We want to be able to be innovative. We want to be able to disrupt our market and to find the next big thing. And we want to make sure that we're building the right product, right? We call that product fit. So predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost savings, innovation, and product fit. Can you guys think anything else? Anybody want to throw one or two out? De-risk, yeah, I agree with that. I think I would have that captured in one of those other things, but yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? So here's the interesting thing to me, is I think a transformation that is focused on predictability might be slightly different than a transformation based upon innovation or product fit, right? One that's really driving for high quality might be different than one that is driving for early return on investment. So what I'm stating here in this particular section is that what you are trying to achieve in your transformation matters not only in terms of your transformation strategy, but also in terms of the methodology choices that you make. Does anybody think that a lean startup, really innovative kind of thing would lend itself towards making a meeting commitments against a fixed time, fixed cost, fixed scope project? Probably not, right? I mean, now you might be able to make the argument that maybe you would be more predictable in terms of value realized or capturing market or what have you, and that's probably a valid case. But there's a lot of organizations, especially large, complicated legacy organizations, government space, that the reality is that they're operating off of fixed time, fixed cost, fixed scope. And they want predictability against that. There's a lot of stuff that we can do in Agile to drive predictability, to stabilize velocity, to make sure that we have optionality, that we can make trade-offs, that we can narrow scope. There's lots of different things that we can do to drive predictability, but it's not the same things that we're necessarily going to do to go invent a new market. Okay? So the methodology choices, the way we implement the transformation is going to be informed by the business value that we're trying to create. Next section, the idea of a transformation hypothesis. One of the key slide sequences that you guys will see, and if you go back and look at any of the other videos when I do longer form talks of this, is that one of my challenges with the Agile community is that we talk about, cool, all right, is that we talk about culture. Hey, thanks, appreciate it, yeah. I've never been excused this early into a talk, right? Nope, you're done, man, out, sucked. You should have done all your slides. This one slide strategy wasn't working for us. What's interesting is that we all show up and we go, we want to change culture, right? Because culture feels like the problem. Because you know what? If we could just get everybody to think about this problem differently, all the other stuff would be easy. And one of the questions that I ask, and I love doing this in like user groups, is I say, okay, if you were king for a day, and you could, by virtue of fiat, tell everybody in the organization they had to think differently tomorrow, right? And then you get everybody to flip simultaneously. What would you do tomorrow to guarantee predictability? Or to guarantee that you could put a product in the market faster? Okay? The hurdle feels like mindset. But once you get past that thin veneer of mindset, most people don't know what they would go do. Right? They don't. Right? Because you get past mindset and then you say, well, okay, I'm going to teach you how to do Scrum. How is a daily stand-up going to cause you to be able to deliver with higher quality? Right? So what we're kind of learning is that there's three facets of change that all have to be dealt with largely simultaneously. And what you guys need to know as change agents within your organization is how each of those three facets are going to lead towards the business outcomes that you want. It's not enough to say we have to change the culture and then hope for a miracle on the other side. You guys ever see that little diagram? It's probably 20 years old now. It's like two scientists sitting at the whiteboard or chalkboard. They didn't have whiteboards, right? Chalkboard. And it's like all this math on one side, and it's all this math on the other, and then it says like, then a miracle happens here. That's kind of like what we're doing in the Agile community, right? We're saying like, if we could just get this culture right, everything would be good. Oh man, if we could just get people doing retrospectives, everything would be good. Our fundamental hypothesis is that Scrum was built around a fundamental structure. Complete cross-functional teams, those teams operating off of a clearly articulated backlog and able to produce a working tested increment of product at the end of every sprint. The fundamental thing that gets in the way of that in most organizations are dependencies. We don't know how to break the dependencies, so therefore we break the process to accommodate the dependencies. Okay? And really the core of transformation strategy, whether it be at the single team level or whether it be at scale, is this idea that I call teams, backlogs, working tested software. If we can't get to complete cross-functional teams operating off of a clearly well-identified, well-articulated backlog, able to produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint, I will guarantee you no amount of methodology is actually going to drive the business outcomes that you want. Now, don't get me wrong. You'll be doing awesome safe. You'll be doing awesome Scrum. Probably won't be doing awesome XP, but you get the idea, right? Might be able to do good Kanban, right?
Can you repeat that? That seemed like really
Yeah, it's up on the slide. No, I'm just kidding. That's where visual references might actually help, right? Yeah, but doing this in talk, this is like, I mean, I can go for hours with this stuff, but like doing it in 50 minutes, I want to try to kind of hit the high points. The thing that I think is the most critical in a transformation, I'm kind of bleeding up into the theory and approach section, is this idea that we have to have complete cross-functional teams. So what is a complete cross-functional team? It's not a group of people working on a project. It's not a group of people dedicated to a project. It is that, but that's not it in its entirety. It's a group of about 6 to 8 people, maybe it's 12, maybe it's 4, right? Not being super dogmatic about that have ownership over their technology stack and are focused at a well-identified business problem. Okay? If we want to go super deep into it, you could take a business capability or a product line or a set of services within an organization. We want the team to be able to own the technology stack, deploy it on command, and we want that technology stack and those people to be focused at something that the business cares about. That is a team in Agile. It's implied in the Scrum guide. I'm making it super explicit. Without a team like that, velocity will never stabilize. You will not get predictable against a known backlog. Super difficult to get to a definition of done at the end of every sprint. And so what happens is that people do a lot of Scrum, daily standouts, reviews, retrospectives, story point estimation, burn down charts, all that stuff, but it's not creating the momentum that they want. So the first litmus test for me is if we can't form teams, I tell my teams this, my teams in my company, it's like if you can't get the organization to form teams, you're stealing money from them. It's that big of a deal, right? There is no success in Agile outside the context of a team, okay? I can break the rule for Kanban, but we're not dealing with nuance in this particular talk. We're dealing with absolutes, right? Okay, that team has to be able to operate off of a clearly articulated backlog. What's a clearly articulated backlog? User stories, right? Whatever we want to put in there. They're small enough that we can establish steady throughput through the life of a sprint. They're specified enough where we can get to a definition of done, independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, testable, right? However you guys want to define it. But the idea is that they're clear enough that the team can pull them into sprint planning, execute, and deliver in a 1 to 4 week period. Right? That's it, right? I don't care whether you have a product owner or not. I care whether you have a backlog. If the product owner can produce the backlog, awesome. If the product owner can't produce the backlog, you better figure out how to get me a backlog. Because a Scrum team not operating off of a clear backlog doesn't work, period. Right? The last element, to get to a working tested increment at the end of every sprint. We can debate the nuances of that one all day long too. But if the team can't get to a clearly identified definition of done by the end of the sprint, you know what they're doing? They're piling up an indeterminate backlog that you can't see that's going to make it to where you can't deploy when you need to deploy. Period. Right? And that's your litmus test. Teams, backlogs, working tested software. So everything in your Agile transformation is going to come down to how do I create teams, how do I create backlogs, how do I produce working tested software. It's scale. This is a little nuance to do this without slides, but I talk about structure, governance, and metrics. Right? What does the team-based organizational structure look like? How are we going to govern the flow of value across teams? What are we going to measure and control in a way that preserves agility rather than working against agility? Okay? But that's the approach, right? The approach that we have to start to think about is how are we going to form teams, how are we going to build backlogs, how are we going to produce working tested software. Again, the things that are going to get in the way of doing that are mostly dependencies. Okay? And in the presence of dependencies, you have one of two choices. You have to either manage dependencies or you have to break dependencies. Anybody have a context that they're working in where they've got lots of unmanaged dependencies? If you're doing Scrum, Scrum assumes that all of the dependencies are encapsulated within a single team. Period, full stop. right? You can say, well, Scrum of Scrums, but Scrum of Scrums, if you really think about it, is a late dependency identification model, right? You got a bunch of teams that are at capacity, they realize they need each other, they escalate to the Scrum of Scrums, it happens late, everybody's at capacity, there's nothing to do with that work, so therefore it doesn't get done or it gets done late, destabilizes delivery. I would suggest that SAFe, while it has language and mechanisms for dealing with dependencies, it assumes it's all captured within the release train and within the PI. And I would suggest that dependency management, even within SAFe, is way too ad hoc. Okay? And dependencies are what is going to kill your ability to be agile. Okay? So let's kind of reset on where we're at, right? We have our business case. We know what we're driving towards. We have our transformation hypothesis. Are we going to start with culture? And if so, how's that going to move us forward? If we're going to start with practices, how is that going to move us forward? And then we have this idea of systems, which I talk about as structure, governance, and metrics. What is the ecosystem that that process and culture is going to live in? Okay? What levers are you going to pull? Okay? Once you've decided on the levers, I would suggest that the theory and approach is teams, backlogs, working tested software. How are we going to get those three elements pervasive within the larger organization? And here's the interesting question. What are we going to do in the presence of dependencies to manage them while we're in the process of breaking them? Okay? That's the key. So what we find is when we go into a lot of organizations that are doing early stage work, they have to do more planning than they want to do to be able to accommodate the dependencies. And one time I walked in, I say one time, it happens almost all the time, you walk into an organization that's trying to adopt SAFe. Anybody struggle to get like all of the requirements identified and the dependencies identified and scheduled and coordinated in like 2 days? Right? It's super difficult, right? I mean, we're dealing with some like really large, complex clients, and I'm not making fun of SAFe. I have all the respect for SAFe, but I'm like, well, why didn't you like plan before you got to the meeting? And they're like, can we do that? And I went, I don't know, right? How important is it that you come out of that meeting with a well-groomed backlog, right? Pretty darn important, right? It's one of the 3 non-negotiables. And so, like a lot of times, it's really just as simple. When you're implementing SAFe in the presence of a lot of architecture and dependencies and just organizational dysfunction, is you have to get ahead of that. You have to create a cadence that is ongoing, can often be managed using like a simple Kanban process that manages and starts to queue up dependency-aware requirements. Right? And so how do you formalize that? Right? Well, it's tough, right? Because SAFe doesn't say that you need to do that, but I'm telling you, most organizations in the presence of dependencies need to. I would also suggest that once you get the dependencies decomposed, right, if you can start to, broken rather, you can start to change the governance model and start to do team-based or capability-based or product-based or services-based funding. Right? The reason why it's so hard to break the project monolith is because these big business requirements, they span out across all the different pieces of the technology architecture. If we could get to a point where we had like a platform investment strategy, a product investment strategy, business capability investment strategies, right? We could start funding things that were designed to be encapsulated within a single team or group of teams. But it's really tough to have that conversation in the presence of dependencies, right? So it creates a whole different class of dependencies, okay? And so just that recognition, if you guys take nothing else from this talk other than the teams, backlogs, working tested software, and that dependencies are not your friend, they are not designed to be left in place, they have to be managed. Okay? And getting into this whole reference architecture, reference implementation, if you look at like the teaming strategies within SAFe and the teaming strategies within large-scale Scrum or the teaming strategies within disciplined Agile delivery or even in the small with Scrum, you will find that what I said about teams, backlogs, working tested software I think holds true in all of them. Right? They have different tools and techniques for how they want you to scale. Large-scale Scrum basically assumes less dependencies. SAFe assumes more dependencies. but I don't think fully respects all of the dependencies in the ecosystem. So sometimes we're even going to put in more controls than SAFe recommends. But if you can start to recognize this teams, backlogs, working tested software pattern, dependency management patterns, right, as you start to improve your ability to form teams, create backlogs, and produce working tested software, often through the progressive elimination of dependencies within the organization, then you can start to deprecate some of the control. And so what you find is that SAFe is often insufficient for highly dependent environments, and it's actually sometimes too heavy when there's not a lot of dependencies, right? There's other ways you can do it for less in the presence of dependencies, or in the absence of dependencies. Okay? So understanding where you're at on that continuum will absolutely inform your methodology. So the holy grail here, right, is to be able to articulate a strategy for this is how we're going to form teams and this is how we're going to govern. And then as we start to break dependencies and reduce organizational dysfunction over time, what controls do we have in place that we can begin to start to deprecate? Okay? So that's why it's so important to understand these fundamentals from the theory and approach and to understand what your fundamental reference architecture is, because your practices are going to evolve as you improve the system. You want to lighten the practices as you improve your system. Does that kind of make sense? It's like big ideas, right? And this is the reason why it's so difficult. Because a lot of times as practitioners, we don't have the agency within the enterprise to create the level of encapsulation at the team level that we need to. We don't have the ability necessarily to inform or make governance changes. We don't get to dictate what the KPIs are. Okay? So what we do is we operate within our pocket, and unfortunately what we find is that we're going through the motions a lot of times. And so one of the incarnations, this talk is a culmination of 8 years of me building decks and doing these kinds of things. A couple years ago, the iteration of this deck was the Executive's Guide to Leading Large-Scale Agile Transformation. And one of the cases that I was trying to make through that deck was this idea that what we have to start to do is we have to start to get really direct with our executives early on in a transformation and let them know what it is that we're actually looking to transform. Because if we walk in and say, we want to do an Agile transformation and we're going to give people a bunch of classes on how to be better leaders or more empowered or have an Agile mindset, they're like, yeah, sure, okay, cool, I'll pay for that, right? They say like, do you want to do Scrum? Sure, I don't care whether you do Scrum as long as you hit all the dates that I committed to for you, right? Seriously, do whatever methodology you want, I don't care, right? But when we say to them, you have to encapsulate teams. You have to put in adaptive governance. You have to change your measures and controls. And by the way, here's all the dependencies. Oh, and by the way, even more since heavy banking industry, right? 50 years of legacy COBOL that like basically runs all your ACH transactions, right? How are you going to begin to untangle that? And by the way, if you don't, like what good is it if you do Scrum? Right? So tons of dependencies. Right? And so as practitioners, we can sit here and be really real with each other. We're going to get a certain amount of benefit from having daily stand-ups and being more collaborative and working together as a team and right, all that kind of stuff. Just don't oversell the benefit of it. Right? If we can't encapsulate teams and break dependencies, cool, right? We'll do some Scrum and it will be better. But it won't be what it can be, right? If we don't transform the organization. Okay? And so now it gets to how do we deal with change management, right? One of the things that we find, and this is probably one of those things where a visual would have been kind of cool, but the definition, like if you think about like how we're really trying to measure or create change that we can measure change, is we have to start to think about like what is the unit of value in an Agile transformation. Right? How many people have like a transformation plan that says, oh, I'm going to train these people, and I'm going to get these Scrum Masters, I'm going to run them through CSM class, and I'm going to make sure these teams have backlogs, which that's actually kind of valid. But I mean, there's lots of like what I might call like vanity metrics in a transformation. And what I would suggest is that when we're starting to think about literally managing change, what the unit of value of a transformation is a transformed organization. It's an organization that is actually delivering with better predictability. It's delivering in smaller batches. It's able to put things in market faster. And so we talk about this idea of iterative and incremental change, or like actually I'll probably say it differently, incremental and iterative change. An increment of change is an organization, an encapsulated organization. You can think value stream, you can think release train, whatever you want, right? It's a group of teams that kind of work together to solve a common problem. That is an increment of transformation. An iteration of transformation is going from this highly dependent, dependency coordinated, cross-cutting concerns identified organization to one that can progressively over time start operating with independence at the team level. And you can start to think about that as a progression, right? So we have increments of the organization, complete groups of teams that deliver common value into, they progress through an iterative model of high control, lesser and lesser and lesser and lesser control as you begin to start to think about improving the system. The reason why this has been valuable to us as a consultancy, and I would suggest that it's equally as valuable to you guys as internal change agents, is that I gotta believe that at some point somebody's coming up to you and saying, how do I know this is working? Anybody ever got the how do I know this is working question? Right? Yeah. Guys, you guys are not good at raising your hands today. It's like, so I'm just gonna stop asking you guys questions, but you get the idea, right? It's like, how do we know it's working? Right? And the idea is, what we want to be able to say is that we had a hypothesis that we were going to take this group of 9 teams and we were going to get them predictable in 4 months. And here's how we measure that they were predictable. And then we're going to get them to reduce batch size. And this is how we can start to measure what the reduction in cycle time is on the features, right? The more frequent that we're able to release into production. Right? Here's how we were able to measure getting the teams operating with more autonomy. This is how we were able to measure innovation and product fit, right? And you can start to create a metrics program that kind of measures where you're at along this continuum. Because the problem that you have is that when you train people and you hope for improvement, I think we all have enough anecdotal evidence of this 20 years in that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So why isn't it working the same way all the time? Right? It's because our fundamental hypothesis of transformation. What Scrum fundamentally taught us was that Scrum doesn't fix anything, it just shows you your impediments, right? And then it's up to us to remove the impediments. But what if it shows us impediments that we don't have agency to fix? We just get stuck, right? And so all I'm saying is that the things that we need to do to fix it have to be first order concerns. And believe it or not, we're deep into this on a couple of like multi-thousand people transformations. The largest we're running right now is about 13,000. And I'm telling you, the patterns hold across all the different companies. You have to do the same kinds of things to get an organization predictable, right, at 13,000 as you do at 600. Right? And then the progressions are all relatively common. Now, don't get me wrong. The uniqueness of the technology stack, the uniqueness of the people, the uniqueness of the business problem, the political things you have to overcome, the challenges, right? All that stuff is unique, right? But the framework for change is pretty consistent, right? Once you kind of get in your head that the unit of value is a transformed organization, is a better performing organization. And you can actually start to lay out what does better performing mean over time. It doesn't have to be a guess, right? And then that gets into the metrics, right? There's typically 2 kinds of metrics that I want you to care about. The first kind of metric, and actually the least important, is how are we progressing against our hypothesis? This is kind of an analog to like building a backlog, right? So on one hand, we know the size of our backlog, we know the size of the user stories, we can establish velocity, and we get our burn down against our known backlog, okay? Relatively straightforward, very mechanical. We can kind of cast out the backlog, we can measure progress. Life's good, right? And so I call those transformation metrics, right? Are we doing what we said we were going to do, and are we creating the conditions that we said we would create? The other side are your financial performance metrics. The financial performance metrics are, okay, now that we've done this work, are we getting the return on investment in market that we hope for? Can we actually measure that the organization has become more predictable? Can we actually measure that we're able to get things in market and sell them and increase the revenue that we're delivering? Can we actually measure that the defect rate has gone down? Can we actually show how we've saved costs? Can we actually demonstrate through customer feedback that we're building more of the right product? Can we demonstrate through things we put in the market that we're disrupting our industry? Right? All those kinds of things. Those things can be measured too. And those are the things that count. Right? Adoption of Scrum practices doesn't count. It just doesn't. It doesn't matter. Okay? An improved organization is what actually matters. Make sense? You guys with me? Tracking? It's hard, right? It ups the game, man. What is it? I can't remember what's the blue pill or the red pill, but you got to take one of them. Right? And then if you take the one that, like, it's never the same. Is it the blue pill? It's the red pill. Damn. Ah, so okay. So now I'm forever messed up because yeah. Okay, cool. But you guys get the idea, right? It's like once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? And it's like everything else we're doing is vanity metrics, right? If we can't form teams, build backlogs, produce working tested software, break dependencies, and measure progress, we're just kind of stuck, right? We're going through the motions. And then what's been fascinating for me, and so this last column is a little bit self-indulgent for me because I started off, like, just candidly, eight and a half years ago, August 1st, 2010, I went as an independent consultant. I just want to be an Agile coach and work for myself, right? Seriously. I had like this idea that, like, if I could make twice my income and work half the time, life would be good, right? Sounds kind of neat, right? It's a good hypothesis. 110 people later, 250 clients later, I became the CEO of this, like, really fast-growing consultancy. And I desperately, when we started this thing, wanted everybody to be flat. Like, because you think about this egalitarian kind of, like, we're all in it together. But then what you realize is that people have different strengths, right? And so from an organizational design perspective within a consultancy, we've learned a lot of things the hard way, and a few of them I'll share with you guys. One of the big challenges we had is that people have different focuses. There's people that are, like, really heavily practice focused. There's people that are process focused. There's people that are technology focused. There's people that are what I would consider, like, good managers and people that can, like, orchestrate work. And then there's people that can create space and align executives on vision and things like that, okay? And what we found is that in any non-trivially sized engagement, and almost even to the point, even in smaller engagements for us, we have to be able to populate a team with all of those different kinds of skill sets, right? Because what you guys don't want to do is have a coach on your team get audience with your CIO and start talking about Scrum, right? It's just not good strategy, right? What we're actually doing to ourselves industry-wide, and so I talk to a lot of people in, like, a pre-sales process, and what we're doing to ourselves industry-wide is that we are equating Scrum, Safe, Agile in general as a team-level delivery practice. Okay? And that's how people, like, when I start to use that language, feel like, no, I'm talking about business agility. No, I'm talking about digital transformation. I'm talking about enterprise change management. Well, I am too, but as soon as I use the word Scrum or Safe, I get relegated into a corner. And we're doing it to ourselves, right? Because our practitioners are getting audience with the wrong people sometimes. Okay? So as a leader of change within your organization, you guys have to understand who in your enterprise can create and hold space with executives. Then there's, like, a tier of people that can kind of fill the space with a well-run, well-thought-out kind of engagement strategy, can do a lot of this analysis around theory and approach and reference architecture. And then you're going to have a group of people that just, like, they show up and they can work with teams, right? And it's awesome. And they're great at working with teams. They're just not the people that are great at casting vision. Right? Another class of things that we have learned largely the hard way is in terms of how to hire talent. And I'm just going to let you guys in on something that is super real for me every single day. And I want you guys just to have a heads up on it. When we first started hiring, we started hiring for what I would call skills and experiences, community and culture. Right? If you knew your Agile stuff, right, you had all the right experience, you were really active in the community, and you weren't a jerk, you could come work for me, right? And we were running about 50-50, right, on people that would stick with us. There's actually more former leading Agile employees than there are current leading Agile employees, which I think is kind of fascinating, right? And so why? right? We're not an awful place to work. It's just that coaches would get on the ground with certain clients and they would flame out. So we started doing analysis as to why, right? Because we're in the people business, and so like we had to understand why. We had to hire better. We don't like to fire people, right? These were all great people who we still love. It's just that they just couldn't work for me anymore. And one of the things that we started exploring was this idea of what we call beliefs, right? And what you find is that there are people in this world that are really people-focused and they're really team-focused. And that's a great place to be unless you're sitting in front of an executive who's enterprise-focused and business-focused. And so we kind of started to think, we started thinking about people in quadrants, right? People-focused, team level, people-focused enterprise, and then there were like people-focused business, and then people-focused, yeah, it's just like this little quadrant thing. And we started trying to untangle, because what we found is that your underlying belief systems kind of drive where you go when you're under pressure. Right? So you can talk an enterprise agile game until that CEO is like, you know, our return on investment, right? All these metrics are all this stuff, and you're like, oh, we just need to work on the culture, right? Well, that would not be the best message for that particular executive, right? So understanding where people's beliefs are was pretty key for us. Then where we've done a ton of research, and we just have years and years and years of data on this at this point, it's fascinating. We run everybody who comes through our door through this instrument. It's called People DNA. And basically think about like Myers-Briggs, DISC, whatever, just on steroids, unpacks you on all these different levels. And what we found is that some of the failure modes that we were starting to see weren't in the knowledge or even conceptual thinking or what have you. They were in things like resilience, self-awareness, recovery time. So like if you think you know everything and an exec hurts your feelings and you're inclined not to re-engage but to go hide, and it takes you a long time to get over it, right, to get your feelings unhurt, right, that's a tough place to be as a consultant, right, because you're charging a bunch of dollars every single day to be on the ground, and like you're kind of like avoiding the key person that you need to be able to deal with, right? So how do you start to anticipate that behavior up front, right? So we started building models around that, and then we started exploring things like IQ, right? How fast can you think on your feet? We started exploring emotional intelligence, like how well can I read your body language, right, across the table. So think about it. Think about this combination. Not everybody's super verbal. So you could be, you know, my vice president of engineering, and you just shift in your seat a little bit and have a puzzled look. Can I read that, realize you might be uncomfortable, pivot my teaching strategy in real time, right? And then when I get resistance, not get my feelings hurt and go hide for a couple weeks. Right? That's fascinating, right? You start to think about those behaviors, but that's often what happens with a coaching team. Right? And so starting to understand some of those failure modes up front. We're exploring a couple things right now. I don't know how to quantify them other than subjectively, but I think there's something around like systems thinking and pattern recognition, the ability to see order in chaos, right? Lead others to be able to start to untangle that. Like we don't have a good way of measuring that, but we're exploring it. One of the things I'm super geeked on right now, and I just kind of learned about this accidentally, is this little instrument we use called color code. They were thinking about starting to go through with all of our prospects. We already do it with all our internal people. And it has to do with, are you logical or emotional, controlling or non-controlling? Right? And what's fascinating is that, and this is probably a reflection of me, as you might imagine, I'm like incredibly logically controlling, right? I have this little itty bitty sliver of feelings, right? It's just tiny, tiny, barely registers, right? And what's interesting, right? So when my engagement style is to intellectually convince you to do something, and I am so high on that continuum, like I'm relentless about it. So just if you ever call me and want a meeting, you just know you're just going to get that from me, right? It's just the way it goes. But there's another interesting set of personalities that are equally as controlling, but more on the emotional side. And then there's emotional and logical non-controlling, which is fascinating. And one of the things that we're finding is that the non-controlling personalities tend to be more back of the room coaches. Are you guys familiar with that kind of idea? Like more like facilitative, participative, engaging, right? All that kind of stuff, right? And then the more what we call red-yellow personalities tend to be more driving, right? Some of the best coaches I've got are red-blue. They're controlling on like every level, right? Emotional and logical. One young person that worked for us for a little while, I categorized her as you're going to do it my way and you're going to like it. kind of a thing. Which seems very not agile until you're running a transformation like this. Right? If you're running a back-of-the-room transformation trying to get culture to shift, right? White-blue personalities might be kind of positive, or white-yellow personalities might be kind of positive. But in a plan-driven, kind of more architected transformation, this red-yellow thing was kind of an interesting lens for us, and it started predicting some other behaviors. Some of the other stuff wasn't showing us. And so, point being is that, 1 minute, awesome. So point being is that there's just a lot that goes into thinking about this stuff, right? Understand your business problem, understand what levers you're going to pull, have a hypothesis for how you're going to get there. What are you shooting towards? How are you going to manage change? How are you going to measure? And then what people are you going to bring to bear to do it, right? All of that stuff together is the stuff that I think you guys need to consider as you're putting together these plans. So that's my take. Hope you guys enjoyed it.